hanes mewn ysgolion, a dwi'n galw ar gadeirydd y Pwyllgor Ddeisebau i gyflwyno'r cynnig, Janet Finch-Saunders.
Diolch, Llywydd. Thank you. Now, this debate is a first for the Petitions Committee as it actually covers 2 petitions, both of which concern the teaching of history in our schools. We welcome the opportunity to discuss these petitions together, and we believe that this is a timely debate, given that the new curriculum for Wales is currently being scrutinised and due to be taught from 2022. The petitions we are discussing today both relate to what students learn about the history of Wales and its people. Both have demonstrated strong public support. I will start by outlining each petition and its context before moving to the points of similarity between them. These lie in several questions about how schools and teachers will be guided and support to equip our young people with the knowledge proposed by the petitions. The first petition received, Petition 992, concerns the teaching of Welsh history. It was submitted by Elfed Wyn Jones, having collected 7,927 signatures. It calls for the Welsh Government to create a common body of knowledge about Welsh history and for this to be taught to all pupils in Wales. It argues that this history and heritage is crucial to an understanding of modern Wales and that key events and subjects in the nation's history should be taught to everyone. The petition references a similar recommendation made by the Culture, Welsh Language and Communications Committee as part of its inquiry into the teaching of Welsh history. That committee noted that taking this approach would allow all pupils to have an understanding of how their country has been shaped by local and national events within the context of Welsh, British and international histories. That recommendation was rejected by the Welsh Government on the basis that the new curriculum is purpose-led and intentionally moves away from specifying lists of topics and content to be taught. Instead, as the Minister has outlined on other occasions, the new curriculum seeks to give teachers and schools the freedom to take their own decisions about what is taught within a broad national framework. Now, if I may digress slightly, this tension between the vision for the new curriculum and calls for specific subjects and issues to be taught as part of it has been a regular feature of Petitions Committee meetings over the past few years. It is a genuine tension and it illuminates the crucial importance of getting the guidance and the resources that will accompany the curriculum right. That issue is at the heart of both of these petitions. To outline the argument made by this petition further, the petitioner asks, how can we understand the society in which we live if we cannot understand what has happened in our past? He argues that the extent to which pupils are taught about key moments in this history is variable and wants this to be addressed by the new curriculum. Central to the petition is a call for core historical content to be established and for resources to be developed to support schools and teachers to deliver consistent teaching, a point I will return to later on. I will leave it to the Minister to outline the way in which she has responded to these arguments. However, I will mention that the Petitions Committee has considered written evidence from Estyn, which is currently conducting a review of the teaching of Welsh history in schools. This seeking examples of best practice and may end up making its own suggestions. The work, of course, has been badly affected by the pandemic and is now not likely to report until summer 2021. I will now move on to the other petition in this debate, which is also the 1000th petition to be considered by the Petitions Committee, certainly a significant landmark for our processes. It is also one of the largest petitions we have received, having gathered and I did say one of the largest petitions we've received, having gathered 34,736 signatures after it was submitted by Angharad Owen in June of this year. The petition was submitted following the killing of George Floyd by a police officer in the USA and the protests that followed across the world, many of course linked to the Black Lives Matter movement. The petition is one of the fastest growing petitions to the Senedd, reflecting the importance of the issues it raises and the pressing need for us to do more to tackle racism in our society. In Britain, many of the protests that followed George Floyd's death focused on the legacy of colonialism and slavery. This petition calls for that history and specifically the part that Wales played in it to be represented in the curriculum. The petition argues that the British Empire has sometimes been glamorised, whilst the global impact of colonialism has also been downplayed, with a direct impact upon the lives of Black and minority ethnic people in Wales today. Where this petition is focused is on ensuring that sufficient coverage is given to teaching about the legacy of these aspects of our history in our schools, including the role Wales played and the impact on Black and minority ethnic people in Wales. The petitioner has acknowledged that teaching these issues can be daunting for teachers. It can be a highly charged subject with a direct personal relevance to the experiences and perspectives of individuals as well as to current world events. Therefore, the petition argues that additional resources and support are required to equip teachers with the information and confidence to address these subjects appropriately with their students. Responding to the petition, the Minister has referred to a working group established to consider Black and minority ethnic histories as part of the story of Wales under the chairing of Professor Charlotte Williams. I will leave it to the Minister to explain more about this work, which has the potential to lead to some of the change sought by this petition, but I want to note our support for it at the outset. In concluding my opening remarks, it is important to acknowledge that the histories raised by these two petitions are both equally part of the story of Wales and its people. A full teaching of our history, good and bad, and what it means for today's Wales must seek to speak to everyone and to develop in our young people a rounded and nuanced view of what came before them. That is no small challenge. However, this is an opportune moment to hold this discussion, both due to world events and the development of the new curriculum and the resources which will support it. The Petitions Committee acknowledges the flexible approach at the heart of that curriculum's design. The challenge, of course, for the Minister and everyone involved in its development is to ensure that people can have confidence that pupils will be provided with key information about the forces that have shaped today's Wales, and that our teachers and students will have the resources and training to support them in this. I very much look forward to hearing the contributions of other members during the rest of this debate. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you.
Susie Davies.
Diolch yn fawr, Llywydd. Can I just say well done to all the people who signed both of these petitions. My group will not only be noting these today, but supporting what the petitioners are asking for. Petitions themselves are part of our history, and in particular, they were encouraged by that great Clyde favourite, Edward I. Monarchs and governments had for decades been routinely dismissing prayers for aid or justice made by the aggrieved, and it was Edward who encouraged them to bring forward their business directly to Parliament to influence the government and the king. And whether that's about being a good king to his people or simply a PR stunt to improve his reputation, Who knows? But the decision was the beginning of an evolution of the concept of Parliament into a place where the voice of people, all people, is heard and respected. I'd just like to pick out an issue from each of the petitions. And the first is, from the first petition, what's in and what's out? What goes into this? Who still cares about Edward I, for example, and why? It's over 700 years ago since he was part of our story. That's a long time to hold a grudge, so why even mention him? And if the compulsory teaching of Welsh history means that our children only ever hear of him as the villain who battered Wales and sneaked a changeling into the role of Prince of Wales, then they're going to get shortchanged anyway. If, however, he's presented to Welsh pupils as a real case study about what motivates powerful figures of history and the ripple effects of their decisions, then he's a really interesting example. I mean, was he just a violent narcissist? Was he a creature hyper-conscious of his divine duty? Was he immersed in contemporary expectations of leadership? Judging who he was and what he did, what do we learn by comparing him to Stalin or Mao Zedong, for example, by applying modern mores? What was his effect on the everyday life of everyday people, and how does that compare with our relationship with people in power these days? And there's a school term's worth of history lesson right there, and every bit of it will count as Welsh history. Welsh history is not just about what happened in Wales, but how events and decisions elsewhere affected Wales. What if the mine owners and merchants of South America 300 years ago had decided to get their copper smelted on the river mouths in southwest England? Who'd be living in Swansea today? So where on earth do you start if you're a school leader committed to your pupils receiving a good experience of learning about Welsh history when this tiny fragment can spark such a chain of discussion? And I think it's important to highlight that this petition calls for a common corpus of Welsh history to be taught in all schools, but it's not asking to influence how it's taught. Nevertheless, it points to a deep desire that all our children should grow up knowing more about how the nation in which they are being raised got to be that way. And perhaps this is a good moment to introduce the evidence presented to the Children, Young People and Education Committee by these very children. They have told us that they want to be learning the same things as their peers, and that's not just history. And so I don't think this undermines the freedom of the new curriculum. The design of this curriculum in part is to be informed by what pupils want to learn. So here is a clear instruction that they want at least some common ground across Wales. My second point is about the local curriculum, and this involves the second petition. There will be communities in Wales who might think that Black and ethnic minorities have no more relevance to their local curriculum than Edward I. Now that is an incorrect conclusion, as the petition itself reveals. And history it's a bit like the universe. We can only see about 4% of it, but the other 96% is no less real and no less part of the explanation of why we are, who we are, and where we are. And while there will be other overlooked contributors to the history of Wales, the least we can do is start looking at Black and ethnic minorities who've been here for centuries, just as how we look at events and decisions made about people of colour in other parts of the world have affected our domestic story. I suppose the story of the Chartists will make the cuts on whatever finds its way into any common syllabus. They, of course, are some of our most celebrated petitioners in UK history, let alone Wales. Events didn't turn out quite as they expected, but little did they know that Edward I could claim a tiny little bit of their story. Or indeed the stories of MI5. As of 2010, their ranks boasted more medieval history majors than holders of any other degree, valued for their skills in working with minimal and unreliable information. History is always useful, and that is one hell of a ripple effect. Thank you.
Diolch Llywydd, ac yn gyntaf hoffwn ni ddiolch i'r Pwyllgor Ddeiseba am ddod ar y ddwy ddeiseb yma i sylw'r Senedd, a diolch am eu gosod nhw efo'i gilydd, sydd y peth iawn a'r peth priodol i wneud. A diolch i drefnwyr y ddwy ddeiseb, Elfed Wyn Jones ac Angharad Owen am fwrw ati mor ddygyn i gasglu cyn gymaint o enwa. Dwi'n gwybod mi oedd Elfed Wyn Jones wedi bwriadu cerdded o'r ffarm lle mae o'n byw ym Meirionydd i'r Senedd yng Nghaerdydd mwyn cyflwyno'r ddeiseb a bod yn bresennol yn y ddadl, ond wrth gwrs oherwydd y cyfyngiadau do hynny ddim yn bosib, ond mae o wedi bod yn cerdded yr un pellter ar y fferm yn ôl yn Nhrawsfynydd ac wedi cael sylw i'r pwnc y mae o'n deimlo yn angerddol yn ei gylch yn sgil hynny. Yn y Pwyllgor Addysg Plant a Phobl Ifanc, da ni wedi bod yn trafod y bil cwricwlwm wrth gwrs gan dderbyn tystiolaeth o sawl cyfeiriad. A dwi wedi bod yn trio gwneud y pwynt yn gyson yn ystod y sesiynau trafod, fod angen meddwl nid yn unig am gynnwys y bil fel mae o ar hyn o bryd, ond mae angen meddwl hefyd am unrhyw beth sydd ddim yn y bil, unrhyw beth sydd angen bod ar wyneb y bil ond sydd ddim yno ar hyn o bryd. A dwi yn credu fod y ddau fater sydd dan sylw heddiw a sydd yn gweu i'w gilydd, maen nhw angen bod ar wyneb y bil ac mae Plaid Cymru wedi bod yn dweud hyn yn gyson. Mae angen sicrhau fod pobl Cymru yn gwybod am ein gorffennol fel pobl, am ein gorffennol fel gwlad, a hynny yn ei holl amrywiaeth cyfoethog. Mae'r cyfnod clo wedi tanlinellu pwysigrwydd ein hunaniaeth cenedlaethol, ac mae o hefyd wedi tanlinellu'r angen i roi sylw arbennig a brys i ddileu anghydraddoldeb ar sail hil. Mae angen newid strwythurol mawr, ac yn union fel mae angen dysgu perthnasoedd iach, fel thema draws gwricwlaidd mwyn creu newid o fewn yn cymdeithas ni ac mwyn creu y newid hynna yn y berthynas rhwng menywod a dynion. Mae angen hefyd dyrchafu hunaniaeth ac amrywiaeth Cymru i fod yn thema addysgol draws gwricwlaidd sy'n haeddu'r un statws a chysondeb a pherthnasoedd iach ac addysg rhyw. A'r unig ffordd i sicrhau hynny ydy dyrchafu yr maes, dyrchafu hunaniaeth ac amrywiaeth Cymru i fod ar wyneb y bil a'i gynnwys o fel elfen fandadol ym mhob ysgol mwyn sicrhau cysondeb i bob disgybl. Wedi deud hynny, dwi yn ymwybodol iawn fod na nifer o heriau sylweddol ynghlwm â hyn, a dwi ddim yn mynd i osgoi'r heriau yna, a dwi'n meddwl bod hi yn bwysig i ni i wyntyllu nhw a'i trafod nhw. Mae Deiseb Elfed Wyn Jones yn galw ar Lywodraeth Cymru i greu corff cyffredin o wybodaeth am hanes Cymru. Wan, dwi am herio Elfed chydig yn fan hyn. Pwy sy'n mynd i benderfynu beth fydd cynnwys y corff cyffredin o wybodaeth yma? Dwi yn cytuno fod angen cael corff cyffredin, ond mae angen cydnabod hefyd fod eisiau gwaith trwyadl gan ein harbenigwyr hanesyddol ni a chyn drafod mwyn cyrraedd y nod yma. Mae'r ddeiseb arall yn galw am ei gwneud i'n orfodol i hanesion pobl ddu a phobl o liw gael eu haddysgu yng nghwricwlwm addysg Cymru. A dwi'n cytuno'n llwyr, ond dwi hefyd yn mynd i herio Angharad. Onid un agwedd yn unig o hanes pobl ddu a phobl o liw ydy caethwasiaeth a gwladychiaeth, ac o ganolbwyntio ar yr agweddau hyn, ydyn ni ddim mewn peryg o anghofio cyfraniad cyfoethog cymunedau du Cymru a lleiafrifoedd ethnig Cymru i hanes Cymru yn ei holl amrywiaeth. Dwi am dynnu'ch sylw chi at adroddiad pwysig gath ei wneud 7 mlynedd yn ôl bellach ac mewn panel dan gaderyddiaeth yr hanesydd Dr Elin Jones, ac dwi'n meddwl bod hi'n bwysig i ni atgoffa yn hunan o be ddudwyd yn yr adroddiad yna oedd dan y teitl Cwricwlwm Cymreig, Hanes a Stori Cymru. Dyma eiriau'r panel. Mae llawer o'r drafodaeth ar y maes o hanes a ddysgur mewn ysgolion yn tueddu i bwysleisio cynnwys ffeithiol y cwricwlwm. Ond mae llawer mwy i ddisgyblaeth hanes na chronoleg a gwybodaeth ffeithiol yn unig. Tra bod chronoleg a gwybodaeth ffeithiol yn cynnig fframwaith deall y gorffennol a pherthnasedd gwahanol gyfnodau, datblygiadau a gweithredoedd unigolion, mae hanes yn rhoi cyfleoedd eraill hefyd. Ac yng ngeiriau'r adroddiad eto, un o'r agweddau pwysicaf ar ddisgyblaeth hanes yw'r cyfle mae o'n rhoi i ddod i ddeall fod pob naratif neu ddadl hanesyddol yn agored i feirniadaeth, ac mae barn a model yw pob barn hanesyddol. Nid oes un hanes yn unig, mae gan bob unigolyn ei brofiad ei hun a'i bersbectif unigryw ar y gorffennol. Mae derbyn hynny yn fodd i dderbyn a pharchu gwahanol fersiynau o hanes a'i gwerthuso yn ôl meini prawf mwy gwrthrychol na'n gwybodaeth bersonol o'r gorffennol neu fersiwn gyfarwydd ohono. Mae dysgu hanes yn effeithiol yn fodd i ddatblygu dinasyddion gweithredol dyfodol. Ac fe allog gynorthwyo dysgwyr i ddeall eu hanes eu hun, a ffordd mae'r gorffennol wedi ffurfio'r presennol, ond y bwysicach na hynny, fe all gynorthwyo i ymholi'r hanes hwnnw, a phwyso a mesur gwahanol fersiynau o hanes, a gall roi arf yn erbyn propaganda o bob math yn wylo pob dinesydd. Mae hwn yn ddatganiad pwysig, a dwi yn dod i derfyn, ond mae'n bwysig i ni gofio y cyd-destun yma oedd Dr Elin Jones yn ei roi i ni. Mae dysgu hanes yn effeithiol yn mireinio'n sgiliau ni i ddadansoddi, i gwestiynu, i beidio derbyn bod dim da ni'n weld ar yr olwg gyntaf, ac i adnabod propaganda a newyddion ffug sydd yn beth pwysig iawn yn y byd sydd ohoni. Felly mae yna ddadl gre dros gynnwys hunaniaeth ac amrywiaeth Cymru, gan gynnwys hanes Cymru a hanes pobl ddu a phobl o liw fel rhan fandadol o'r cwricwlwm. Ond peidiwn ag anghofio bod yna lawer iawn mwy i ddysgu hanes, a gwerth aruthrol iddo yn yn uchelgais ni o greu pobl ifanc gwybodus i'r dyfodol. Diolch Llywydd, a diolch am ganiatáu fi ymelaethu.
Pan chi'n trafod Dr Elin Jones yna, o'n i'n mynd i ganiatáu hynny. Mick Antonef. You need to be unmuted. Hold on just 1 second. Try again. Not quite. I'll come back to you, Mick. Jenny Rathbone. I'll come back to you, Mick. Jenny Rathbone.
Thank you very much for calling me. This is a very important subject, and the use of words carries huge significance. In the English language, we talk about history as if it was a male-dominated business. Obviously, herstory is just as important, whether we're talking about the history of women's suffrage in Wales and the struggle we had to go through to get it, or whether we're talking about much wider issues. I think in the context of this specific petition, it is, to take a contemporary theme, it's really sobering to understand that the failure to have any sort of reconciliation after the American Civil War still has massive implications for events going on in the United States today, which allows some citizens to have utter disregard and complacency about the suffering of other citizens that we in this country find really quite extraordinary. But I think we cannot criticise others without looking to our own history and our failure to look at the history of the British Empire, which I think is very much fuels a lot of the resentment felt, quite rightly, by Black citizens of our country. Is, you know, it was founded on slavery, and yet we continue to romanticize the British Empire, glamorize it. We still give people who have performed extraordinary services, public services, medals which contain the words member of the British Empire, commander of the British Empire Medal, which is an utter anachronism to today's society, and clearly something that we have to address. It's equally inappropriate that on Remembrance Sunday we sing "Send her victorious, happy and glorious" about our monarch as the national anthem of the UK, particularly on Remembrance Sunday when we are commemorating the horrors of war. But I also think that we have to look at, in great depth, at more contemporary issues. For example, the Windrush scandal that has yet to be resolved. People who were refused work, to be allowed work, refused benefits, and in the worst cases were deported from this country, have still to receive compensation, and many of them are now dying. How scandalous is that? We really do need to reevaluate our history in light of contemporary problems. And nowhere is that more obvious in this week of all weeks than in relation to climate change. What we do in this country has an impact on people living on the other side of the world. And it's really important that we take these responsibilities seriously and amend our behaviour in solidarity with people who we have never met and never likely to meet, but who suffer because of what we do and the way in which we burn up the resources of the world. So I think these are excellent petitions, and I look forward to seeing the outcome of them in the way we treat history in the new curriculum.
Mark Isherwood.
Well, diolch, Lywodraeth. The teaching of our history in Welsh schools matters. The past informs the future. The loss of the past would mean the most thoughtless of ages. History teaches us that Welsh means British. Both England and Scotland are named after their invaders. However, the Britons remained. Wales is named after the term used by the invaders, meaning foreigner in their language, to describe the Britons across our islands who referred to each other as fellow countrymen and women, the Cymru. We hear of the iron ring of castles built in North Wales after Anglo-Norman conquest, but we hear little of the 100,000 fellow Britons who had died in the attempted genocide in northern England by the Normans, the harrying of the North 2 centuries previously. The first petition we're debating refers to the Glyndŵr Rising. We hear of his dream of a Welsh Parliament, 2 Welsh universities and a Welsh free church. However, history also teaches us that he previously dutifully served the last Plantagenet king and joined the army that king led into Scotland, before rebelling against the first king since the Norman conquest, whose mother tongue was not French, in a plot with Mortimer and Percy to divide the kingdom into 3 parts. The first petition also refers to the drowning of Capel Celyn, which belongs to every community in Wales. However, history teaches us that this is also part of a wider British experience, where communities were flooded when the Rivington reservoirs were constructed to supply water for Liverpool a century earlier. Myths tell stories about the early history of a people, and there are those who believe that the destiny of mystical Britain, Albion, Alba, Alban, is waiting to be awoken as a spiritual leader of the world. According to the 12th century History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, the exiled Brutus of Troy was told by the goddess Diana, "Brutus, there lies beyond the Gallic bounds an island which the western sea surrounds. by giants once possessed, now few remain. To bar thy entrance or obstruct thy reign. To reach that happy shore thy sails employ, their fate decrees to raise a second Troy, and found an empire in the royal line, which time shall ne'er destroy, nor bounds confine. For although commonly dismissed now, Geoffrey of Monmouth's work was regarded as fact until the late 17th century, and the story appears in most early histories of Britain. The teaching of Black and POC UK histories in Welsh schools matters. From one of the first Black people to have lived in Wales, named John Stumclyn, brought to Wales in the 18th century and believed to have married a local woman, to the likes of Shirley Bassey, Colin Jackson, Cardiff's current mayor, and the former mayor of Colwyn Bay, Dr. Sibani Roy, the BAME population of Wales has made significant contributions. Most societies have exploited slave labour at some stage in their history. This is also true of Wales. A slave chain discovered on Anglesey, made to fit 5 people, can be dated to the Iron Age, about 2,300 years ago. When the Romans invaded, they brought their own slaves with them, slaves from nations across the Roman Empire, in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. After the Romans left, the British tribes enslaved those they defeated in battle. The transatlantic slave trade flourished from the early 16th century until 1807, when the British Parliament passed an act to abolish trading slaves within the British Empire. Campaigns to stop slavery have been started by Black and white people more than 30 years before the act was finally passed. The British abolition movement got underway in earnest in 1787, when Thomas Clarkson founded a committee to fight the slave trade. One member, William Dulwin, was an American Quaker of Welsh descent. Campaigners had been laying the groundwork by publishing documents about the cruelty of slavery. One of these was William Williams of Pantycelyn, who wrote the hymn Bread of Heaven. In the 1770s, a number of former slaves published their life stories, and Williams was the first to translate one of these into Welsh. Although Britain was the preeminent slave trading nation during the 18th century, and illegal British slave trading continued for many years after the passing of the 1807 Act, the Royal Navy's role in the suppression of the transoceanic slave trades represents a remarkable episode of sustained humanitarian activity. However, illegal slavery still continues in many parts of the world today, even in Wales. As Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream, let freedom reign."
Delyth Jewel.
Diolch Llywydd. Rwy'n hoffi geiriad y ddeiseb gyntaf rydyn ni'n trafod prynhawn yma yn arbennig. Mae'r pwynt wedi cael ei wneud fod yr iaith yma yn gyfoethog ac yn bwysig. Mae'n galw ar Llywodraeth Cymru i greu corff cyffredin o wybodaeth am hanes Cymru. Fydd pob disgybl yn ei ddysgu, ac wrth gwrs mae'r ail ddeiseb yn gysylltiedig, gan mae'n gofyn i hanesion, pobl ddion a phobl o liw cael ei haddysgu yng nghyriculum addysg Cymru. Mae'r syniad o greu corff cyffredin, mae'n holl bwysig. Mae'r ddeiseb wrth gwrs yn siarad yn llythrenol yma. Mae'n sôn am yr angen i rai benawdau pwysig o hanes Cymru cael ei dysgu ym mhob cwr o'r wlad. Ond mae yna hefyd yma ystyr dwysach, corff cyffredin, corpus yn cael ei greu, casgliad o ffynonellau o ddigwyddiadau, ond pethau sydd wedi llunio a ffurfio corpus y wlad, ffurfio'r bobl, corff gyffredin, ymwybyddiaeth, hunaniaeth y bobl. Oherwydd, dydy'r un ddeiseb na'r llall ddim yn sôn am yr angen i ddysgu plant am hanesion bobl eraill. Na, dysgu am y Cymru, pobl sydd wedi byw a treulio bywyd yma, Cymru o ddiwylliannau gwahanol, sydd eto yn rhan o'r corff cyffredin. Hunaniaeth gyda haenau amryw, lle mae pob un haen yn rhan o'r un. Mae'r geiriad yn ein hatgoffa bod hanes yn ein cysylltu ni, gyda'n gilydd wrth gwrs, ond hefyd gyda'n gorffennol. Hanes sydd wedi ffurfio ni da ac drwg. hanes sydd yn cynnig gwreiddiau I ni. Mae'n dysgu gwersi, mae'n ein cyfoethogi ni, bob un. Ond, dim ond os rydyn ni'n clywed ac yn dysgu am yr hanesion hynny. Cyn y toriad dros yr haf, gwnaethon ni fel Plaid Cymru gynnal dadl ar y pwnc hwn yn gosod mas pam ei bod hi mor bwysig I bobl ifanc ddysgu am hanesion eu cenedl. A dwi'n dweud hanesion yn y lluosog, fel mae wedi cael ei ddweud yn barod yn y ddadl yma, achos does dim un llinyn o hanes sy'n bwysicach na'r lleill. Yn wir, mae angen I blant Cymru ddysgu mwy am hanesion y bobl wnaeth ddim ysgrifennu'r llyfrau hanes. Fel dwedais I yn ein dadl cyn yr haf, os nad yw pob plentyn yng Nghymru yn dysgu am benawdau hynod bwysig hanes ein cenedl, gall hyn am ddifadu cenedlaethau cyfan o synwyr o'i hunaniaeth. Bydden nhw ddim yn gweld eu hunain yn y corpus. Ac mae hynny yr un mor wir am foddi capel celyn, hanes Glyndŵr ar arwisgo, a pherthynas y Cymru gyda cheithwasiaeth, a hanes diwydiannol a diwylliannol ardaloedd fel Tiger Bay. Ers yr haf, I datblygiadau sydd i'w croesawu ac sydd wedi cael eu trafod, roeddwn ni'n trafod rai o'r datblygiadau yma gyda Dr Ellen Jones sydd wedi cael ei chrybwyll yn barod, wnaeth gadeirio'r tasglu ar y cwricwlwm Cymreig hanes y stori Cymru yn 2013. Rwy'n cytuno gyda hi bod lle I groesawu penodiad yr athro Charlotte Williams I arwain adolygiad o'r adnoddau sydd ar gael I gefnogi athrawon I helpu nhw wrth iddyn nhw gynllunio gwersi am hanesion pobl dion a lleiafrifoedd ethnig. Gall y penodiad hwn arwain at wireddu argymhellion yr adroddiad hwnnw am ddatblygu ymwybyddiaeth disgyblion o'r Gymru aml ethnig, aml ddiwylliannol, a thrwy hynny, gwarantu na fydd plant Cymru yn cael eu hamddifadu o wybodaeth o'i hanes eu hunain. Ac mae hyn yn bwysig Llywydd ar gyfer safiad ein cenedl yn genedlaethol. Os nad ydy hanesion Cymru yn cael ei dysgu yn ein hysgolion, bydd myfyrwyr ddim yn dysgu am y penawdau hynny yn y brifysgol chwaith, a gall hyn arwain at fwy o ddirywiad yn niferoedd y ganolfannau hanes Cymru ac astudiaethau Celtaidd yn ein prifysgolion. Bydd hynny yn cael effaith anarfod ar y wybodaeth genedlaethol a'r ffordd mae'r wlad yn portreadu ei hunan ar lwyfan y byd. Ar ôl y ddymiad galarus Prifysgol Cymru, mae'n holl bwysig gwarchod y ganolfan astudiaethau uwch y Cheltaidd, Gwasg Prifysgol Cymru a chanolfan astudiaethau uwch Grygynog. Mae hyn oll yn gysylltiedig. Os does dim brwdfrydedd nac arbenigaidd am hanes Cymru, yr hanesion Cymreig yna I gyd yn ein trafod, byddai'n gwanhau y cysyniad o Gymru a'i chryfder academaidd. Mae angen gwarantu parhad ein cenedl, ein canolfannau arbenigol, creu canolfannau o ragoriaeth newydd, adrannau astudiaethau Celtaidd, nid dim ond yng Nghymru, ond dros y byd. A dyma, be dyn ni'n trafod heno, dyma ydy dechrau y broses yna. Creu corff cyffredin, gwarantu ymwybyddiaeth ein pobl ifanc o'i hunaniaeth. A rwy'n gobeithio'n wir bydd ein corff deddfwriaethol y Mae'r Senedd yn cytuno gyda phwysigrwydd hynny. Diolch.
Nick Antonydd? I think we're still struggling to hear you, Mick. You may need to use the sound control on your own headset. You're almost there.
How's that now?
Oh, excellent. We can hear you now. Carry on.
There we are. Well, firstly, thank you, Chloe. And I was going to say when I started earlier that there'll be some excellent contributions. I was particularly impressed with the contribution of Sian Gwenllian, because I thought she set out not only the sort of philosophy around the teaching of history, but also the considerable challenges that exist. I chaired the committee that looked at the votes for 16 legislation. Of course, we looked closely at the issue of civic education. And I think the teaching of history and the curriculum and civic education actually go hand in hand, because history is essentially pure politics civic, and I say it with a small p, an understanding of what's happened within our society and its engagement. Now, one of the concerns I really have is the lack of materials on many of the historic events and individuals in our communities at a local level. And for me, history is not about the teaching of kings and queens, particularly even Welsh princes. It's really about communities. It's also history of working people and working people's communities. So in the time I have, I'm just going to go through some of the people I think that really are deserving in our history curriculum of being mentioned in, certainly in the communities I represent, that ought to be where there ought to be materials and they ought to be incorporated. And when I go around schools, I find very little information about any of these people, even though they were such significant Welsh figures. Dr. William Price of Llantrysant, a chartist who dealt with occupational health, who did the first modern cremation, very significant political consequences. Arthur Horner, president of South Wales Miners, 1946 president of the NUM, major figure in the nationalisation of the coal industry, had such significance. A.J. Cook, there's a plaque to him in just outside my constituency in the T. Mowell Lewis Merthyr Colliery. He was the General Secretary of the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, but very little taught about this significant figure. What about the history of devolution going back from the 20s, perhaps even earlier, but also to Kilbrandon and so on? The history of the Miners' Federation. How can you talk about modern South Wales history without talking about the development of the South Wales Miners' Fed? The importance of the Taff Vale judgment and the implications on that on democratic rights for trade unions. Wales and the slave trade. Gareth Jones, the Welsh journalist who I've spoken on many times, who now has a street named after him in the Ukrainian capital Kyiv. Yuzovka, John Hughes, founded one of the biggest steel producing areas in the world. The 1926 general strike, how we don't talk about the impact of that on the communities of South Wales. And we remember the poem by Idris Davies, 1926, how we'd remember it till our blood runs dry. Well, I think many of our schools and our history curriculum has forgotten about it. Robert Owen, the founder of the cooperative and trade union movement in many parts of Wales and in Britain. 1984, 1985 miners' strike so impacted, and Evan James, who wrote the Welsh national anthem, who came from Pontypridd. These are just some of the people. There should be materials. They should form part of a broader corpus of the history that has affected and formed the communities that we represent. And for me, that is the important part, the history of working people and working class communities. Thank you.
Neil Hamilton.
Diolch, and it's a great pleasure to take part in this debate, chaired by a distinguished historian herself. For me, history is a living thing. The continuum in which we live is a vitally important part of my imagination, and I'm constantly reflecting about the events of today in their historical context. And therefore, the teaching of history is vitally important. As Mick Antonovich said a minute ago, history is dead politics, but actually history is a living thing, and the politics of previous generations is also a living thing today. We see this in the debate, which has arisen as a result of the Black Lives Matter protests and what's been said about slavery and the role of the British Empire and all that. So it's vitally important that when history is taught, it is taught in an objective way, or as objective a way as is possible. I strongly support the petition on a common corpus of knowledge of the history of Wales. I studied Welsh history in school, and history then was taught perhaps in a rather different way from the way it's taught now. But I think it is very important for people to learn about their place in the history of their nation. You can't, I think, understand the events of today without having some real understanding of how we got where we are. And as the French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville said, if the past ceases to throw its light upon the future, then the mind of man wanders in obscurity. And I think that is a basic truism. But the teaching of history is itself in some ways a political act, or could be a political act, and we have to be careful, therefore, not to allow history to be used as a weapon of political propaganda, even though that might be subconscious. And I think the motion, the second petition on the British Empire displays a lack of understanding in its fullest sense of the role that the British Empire played. And it's vitally important, therefore, that we teach both sides of historical controversies. And history is a checkerboard. It's got black and white squares on it. And to have a full understanding of what happened in the past, we have to revive the controversies which I think surrounded the events and movements which we are teaching about. The British Empire was in many, many ways a force for good, and the role that Britain played, as Mark Isherwood said, in the suppression of the slave trade is a vitally important part of 19th century history. I think what the petition says that Britain, including Wales, benefited from colonialism and slavery for centuries, overstates the economic importance of slavery. It was actually marginal in the economic development of the United Kingdom. And of course, most of the British Empire never had slavery at all. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, great tracts of the world. The slave trade was fundamentally a transatlantic trade. And slavery, of course, has been endemic in all civilizations up to the modern day, all around the world. So the idea that the British Empire came in and enslaved people who were otherwise living in sort of free democratic countries is, of course, preposterous. So we have to see the events of the past in the context of their own time. We have to understand the minds of the people who were making history at that time against the context of those days. And therefore, many individuals who were regarded as great men in their days, we now regard as flawed in many respects. But we need to teach the good with the bad and the bad with the good. So that's vitally important as well. But I mean, Britain, through its empire, which of course covered a quarter of the globe at its zenith in the 1920s, introduced to those countries the rule of law, incorrupt administration. It gave these countries the English language. India was unified as a result of its incorporation into the empire. Modern India would look very different in geopolitical terms from what it does today had it not been for the British Empire. As I said a moment ago, we suppressed slavery and we gave these countries the cultural gift of democracy, which was the successor to the British Empire. And also we promoted the economic development of large parts of the world, which supplies the wealth, which of course the populations enjoy today. So there are lots of good things that Britain was responsible for. Slavery was a stain, obviously, but we played an honourable part in its suppression. Black history is important, but I think we have to keep it in its context and into proportion as well, because mass immigration into this country, of course, is a very, very recent phenomenon. And even today, the 2011 census tells us that Wales had a population that was 96% white, 2.3% of Asian origin, 0.6% black. So yes, of course, everybody, whatever race or ethnic makeup they are, want to know the history of their own people, their own forebears. And I think that's an important and necessary part of any history curriculum. But I don't believe that it should dominate everything. We need to teach the history of Wales, we need to teach the history of Britain, and we need to teach the place of Wales and Britain in the world. And if we do that in a constructive, objective way, but encourage people to understand that history is not a fact, because ultimately all history is myth, in a sense. We are constantly reinterpreting the events of the past. What we need to teach people is that history itself is a problem which probably there is no hard and fast solution to, but it teaches you how to analyze events, motivations, and to understand that history is actually what is written by historians, but it isn't necessarily what happened at the time.
And before I call Mike Hedges, can I just for the record say that I'm not the Ellen Jones referenced several times during this afternoon's debate. Dr. Ellen Jones is a preeminent historian in Wales, and I'm no doctor at all. Mike Hedges.
Very briefly, I think if we're going to teach history of Wales, we need to teach a history of the kingdoms of ancient Wales. They actually mean something to many of us. We seem to have gone backwards. When I did O-level history, we did social and economic history. Now in their GCSEs, they study America, South Africa, and Germany. I think we need to go back. And finally, people need to understand their own area, how it happened, how different places relate. And I think if we're going to put a curriculum together or putting some ideas together, we need all those in. Thank you.
The Minister, y gweinidog I gyfrannu'r Dadl Kirsty Williams.
Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Llywydd. The number of signatures received by both petitions is a clear indication of the strength of feeling about the teaching of history in Wales. And we have enjoyed many debates in the Senedd on this topic, and today has been no exception, with some very, very thoughtful speeches and contributions. And of course, this debate today is taking place on a very important date in our history, when on the 4th of November 1839, under the leadership of John Frost, we saw the Newport Uprising. So I don't know whether it's coincidence that the Petitions Committee has been able to secure the slot today, but it is the most relevant of days to be discussing this subject once again. And I'm very happy to update the members on the current situation regarding curriculum development. As I have said many times before, studying the history and histories of Wales is an important element in meeting the four purposes of our new curriculum. The new curriculum framework reflects Wales, our cultural heritage and diversity, our languages and our values, our histories and traditions of each and one of our communities and of all of our people. I am happy, Presiding Officer, to clarify that the new curriculum will contain mandatory elements, including the statements of what matters for each area of learning and experience. Therefore, every school's curriculum will be required by statute to include learning in each of the statements of what matters. And within the humanities area, this must include cultivating a sense of Cynefin, a place and a sense of belonging, an appreciation of identity and heritage, a consistent exposure to the story of their locality and the story of Wales, developing an understanding of the complex, pluralistic and diverse nature of societies, both past and present, and engagement with the past, contemporary and anticipated challenges and opportunities facing them as citizens, their communities and their nation. Now, these will be non-negotiable elements of every school's curriculum for every learner at every stage. It will simply not be possible to ignore the central and critical role of all of our histories, our local and national stories, including Black history, in a school's curriculum. Now, we have all agreed that learning must be inclusive and to draw on the experiences, the perspectives and the cultural heritage of contemporary Wales. Confidence in their identities helps learners appreciate the contribution they and others can make within their different communities and to develop and explore their response to local, national and global matters. This will also help learners to explore, make connections and develop understanding within a diverse society. And the curriculum recognises that our society is not a uniform entity, but encompasses a range of values, perspectives, cultures and histories that includes everybody who lives in Wales. And let me be clear, Cynefin is not simply local, but provides a foundation for a national and international citizenship. As part of the mandatory statements of what matters in humanities, all schools will have to include learning on the appreciation of the diverse nature of societies, as well as understanding diversity itself. Now, in the summer, I appointed Professor Charlotte Williams to lead a working group which will provide advice and recommendations about the teaching of themes related to Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities and experiences. And I'm glad that the chair of the Petitions Committee has welcomed that work. Now, this, it is crucial to say, is not limited to history. It covers all parts of the school curriculum, and I am very much looking forward to receiving the interim report later this month, which will focus on learning resources. The group has developed this work in the context of the new curriculum framework, which avoids prescribing a full list of specific topics or activities. Guidance sets out the concepts that should underpin a range of different topics, learning activities and the acquisition of knowledge. And learners of all ages will be exposed to a range of historical periods on a local and national level. They will consider how local Welsh and world history are connected, shaped and appreciated through the events such as Glyndwr's Rising, the Spanish Civil War and the World Wars of the 20th century. And this is already set out in the guidance that we published earlier this year. Now, I recognise that we need to continue to support teachers with their professional learning to help them move forward with identifying resources, topics and connections. And in order to allow time and space for practitioners to work together across schools to prepare for the new curriculum, we have heavily invested in professional learning with some £31 million already awarded directly to schools. And we will continue to build upon these strong professional learning foundations as we move closer to implementation of the curriculum in 2022. So therefore, I'm confident that the resources, support and guidance being developed will empower schools to deliver meaningful learning about the histories of Wales and its diverse communities in every learning area of learning and experience right across the curriculum. And schools will be supported to engage with heritage professionals, museums and galleries, as well as community and cultural leaders when designing their curriculum in order to enrich the learning and experiences of each and every pupil. So within the parameters set out in the guidance, teachers will have the flexibility to tailor the content of lessons to allow learners to explore their cynefin. We believe that that is the best way forward for them to understand how their local identities, landscapes and histories connect with those on a national and international stage. Teachers will have the freedom to teach the many and diverse histories of Wales and the wider world. And as I have said before, exploring the stories of the people and communities of Wales should not simply be limited to history lessons. The whole purpose and design behind the curriculum for Wales encourages learners to explore themes across the curriculum. The diverse histories of people of Wales can be taught not only in the areas of humanities, but also in languages, literature and communication, and in science and technology. And we will create further resources which will refer to key events and topics in the histories of Wales and the world as we move forward to implementation. And these resources will be there to enable teachers to develop their own curricula. As I mentioned earlier, the working group chaired by Professor Williams has reviewed existing resources to support the teachings of themes relating to BAME experience and contributions right the way across our curriculum. And as has also been referenced, Estyn will also report on their review on the teaching of Welsh history and diversity in schools next year. Its findings will further help us to commission resources to ensure that teachers have the support that they need to deliver the curriculum successfully. However, we recognise that access to good quality learning resources will not necessarily be enough by themselves, and that teachers will need to be provided with the relevant professional learning and development. Early next year, I expect to receive a second report from Professor Williams' working group, which will be considering the professional learning and development needs of staff in our schools in the coming months. The group will provide recommendations on how to ensure that teachers across the curriculum can confidently deliver learning related to Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities and experiences. And forgive me, Llywodraeth, I can't recall which of our colleagues made the point, but Professor Williams is very clear to me that when learning about Black history, it must go simply beyond learning about concepts of slavery. There is much, much more to talk about. And the member that talked about BAME community's positive contribution to Wales, that point was very well made indeed. So, in summary, as part of the mandatory statements of what matters in humanities, all schools will have to include learning on an appreciation of the diverse nature of societies, as well as understanding the concept of diversity itself and an appreciation of their cynefin. And we're continuing to work on the content of the curriculum to ensure that it encompasses experiences and histories which represent the diverse nature of societies that we have here in Wales and across the world. But I thank the members once again. I always find these debates to be some of the best that we have in the chamber, and today has been no exception, as I said. Diolch yn fawr.
Cadeirydd y Pwyllgor Ddeisebau nawr I ymateb i'r ddadl, Janet Finch-Saunders.
Well, thank you, Minister, for your contribution and responding to this debate, and a serious thank you to all the members who have participated today. As I just want to echo, really, there have been some really thoughtful and some really, good contributions here today. So in concluding, I want to thank both petitioners and everyone who supported those petitions in order to get them to this point. I'd like to thank my colleagues on the Petitions Committee and the committee clerking team. The mere fact that petitions can result in these issues being discussed in our Welsh Parliament, albeit virtually in this case, I believe, actually goes to prove and demonstrates the value of the petitions process. This debate has enabled some very important issues to be raised, and these two petitions in particular will be considered further by our committee. In taking the petitions forward, of course, we will be mindful, of course, of young people. The scrutiny being given to the curriculum elsewhere and to the young people, who will be greatly affected by any outcomes of these petitions. The work that's underway by the working group and Estyn and Professor Charlotte Williams has been also mentioned here today. And really, I think it's been a fantastic debate. And I'm sure that anybody watching who may have started the petitions or signed those petitions, I think will be greatly heartened by the interest that these petitions have attracted today. Thank you, Llywyd. Diolch.
Y cynnig felly yw I nodi'r Ddeisebau a oes unrhyw aelod yn gwrthwynebu? Oes, dwi'n gweld un gwrthwynebiad ac felly fe fyddai'n gohirio'r bleidlais tan y cyfnod pleidleisio, a cyn I ni gyrraedd y cyfnod pleidleisio fe fyddwn ni yn cymryd egwyl o 5 munud yn unol ar rheol sefydlog 34.14 pan fyddwn ni yn ailymgynnull fe fyddwn ni'n cynnal y cyfnod pleidleisio.